Our next speaker is a truly great American journalist and a great communicator. Jane Pauley spoke at our opening celebration 5 years ago, and it was the most moving presentation. People still talk about that, still watch it on our website. She became an outspoken advocate for research and mental illness. She joined our leadership board at the McGovern Institute, and we've had the privilege of being able to interact with her over these few years. In her career in television, people always said that she somehow communicated a warmth and sort of down-to-earthness, even though she was an official television personality. But I can tell you, in being able to interact with her personally, she is truly a warm and down-to-earth individual. I do want to tell you a little bit about the details of her career. She was a member of the Broadcast and Cable Hall of Fame. She's been honored with multiple Emmy Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award for Outstanding Achievement, the Radio and Television News Directors Association's Paul White Award for lifetime contributions to electronic journalism. She wrote her book, Skywriting: A Life Out of the Blue, which was an account of her own struggles with bipolar disorder. She's a member of the board of directors of the Children's Health Fund, the Education Reform Organization, the Mind Trust, and co-chair of the advisory board for Freedom from Hunger. It is my absolute privilege to be able to have her speak to us again today. Jane Pauley. Now, do you want this? Yes, okay.
Yeah, I know how to use those. Yeah. Sometimes they make you dress the mic because they think the audience doesn't want to know that there's a microphone, but I always knew the audience knew there was a microphone, so I fuss with dressing it. I think that if you laid a slice of my brain on a dish right now, it would pretty much just lay there. Not a lot of thinking will have to be done over the next 15 minutes or so, and no mice, though I've got a picture of a really cute kitten, my own kitten, on my cell phone, but if you want to see it later. Bob, thank you for a lot of stuff, and Pat and Lori, thank you and congratulations. It seems so pathetic to say thank you, Pat and Lori. One ought to say, on behalf of all mankind, thank you, Pat and Lori, but I haven't been authorized to do so. So my simple personal thanks will have to go with that. Thank you for letting me be part of the McGovern Institute. After I spoke at that opening ceremony here 5 years ago, I was delighted, and I have to say I was some surprised to be invited to join the Leadership Advisory Board, and so many of my esteemed colleagues are here now. I wondered, did I fill a gap on the board, having a degree in political science? Perhaps I was the only member of the advisory board with a Q score. Now this is a unit of measurement that perhaps is unfamiliar to the MIT community. The Q score quantifies the familiarity and appeal of a brand, a company, a television show, or a celebrity. A score, of course, can be higher or it can be lower. So I'm grateful that this program was organized or not organized in alphabetical order, as I would not wish to follow Mr. Alda. Of course, everyone knows and admires Alan Alda. He's kind of geeky for someone with a Q score. You fit right in here. I felt a considerable uncertainty about how I would fit in on my first visit here until Dr. Ann Grabiel's very warm and generous introduction. I think at the time, 5 years ago, she said, "Everybody knows Jane Pauley." Well, I thought that pretty unlikely in a group at MIT, probably didn't watch TV a lot. But I do and did think it pretty likely that anybody who did know who I was would have been sort of surprised to find out that I had suffered bipolar depression. And I have to tell you that no one was more surprised than I was, unless it was the doctor who first recognized it and broke the news to me. I particularly remember his reaction, the poor man, when I broke the news that as I was already at work on a memoir, I would have no trouble weaving bipolar into the narrative because the title of my work in progress was Skywriting, A Life Out of the Blue. Now, being a psychiatrist, I suppose he heard crazy things in his office all day long, but the color did seem to drain from his face when I mentioned the book. Because mental illness was, I guess, not something that was to be talked about outside the confines of a doctor's office, but it wasn't crazy talk. After 30 years in television, I knew a great deal more about my reputation than ordinary people possibly could. I had that Q score, and there was NBC audience research and newspaper and magazine articles to document it, that until the day of that bombshell diagnosis, and did I mention that I was 50 years old at the time, being normal was practically my claim to fame. I was Midwestern. They are sometimes the same thing. But when the president of NBC News said, Jane Pauley has the best mental health in the business, who was I to disagree? I could make no credible claim to being the best or the hardest working or the most beautiful in the industry. But I'll be honest, I owned normal. I thought I did, or I did. Well, here's what happened. About 10 years ago, I was struggling with a medical condition, chronic, recurrent, idiopathic urticaria edema, which is to say, a stubborn, mysterious, and pernicious case of hives, a type that cause swelling, such as in the throat, which, as you can imagine, is not a good thing. I was prescribed steroids. Now, a not uncommon side effect of steroids is mood swings, and my mood seemed to get stuck on the downswing, and so I started filling new prescriptions for antidepressants. As I would subsequently learn, this combination of steroids and antidepressants in a person with a vulnerability to a mood disorder could be something like a 2-stage booster rocket. But me, I had the best mental health in the business, no worries. It was some months before my mood began to lift, but I finally started feeling better, much better, better than ever. In fact, maybe better than anyone. By coincidence, I was starting a 6-week sabbatical from NBC News to write a book. On the very first day of this sabbatical, the day began with a doctor's appointment. And at the end of the appointment, when he usually said, "We have to stop," the doctor said, "Jane, you seem to be racing." We talked about hypomania and bipolar disorder, and he said something about hoping for a soft landing. He later called my husband and said, "Your wife is very sick." The steroids and antidepressants had triggered an unrecognized vulnerability. My 6-week sabbatical segued into a 6-month leave of absence, but I finally returned to work. It was September 10th, 2001. The next day, of course, was September 11th, 2001, which was unrecognized vulnerability writ large. 9/11 put my little story in perspective. The book project was dormant for a couple of years, but eventually I did write it, and my appearance at the opening of the McGovern Center 5 years ago was my very first public talk. So you see, it's really hard to get into MIT. How we talk about mental illness is something I'd like to talk a little bit about. There is one word that I try not to use in my talks, except rather to explain why I don't. Certain words are hopelessly loaded, I guess like certain genes are. I think stigma is such a word. Stigma is what keeps conversations about mental illness confined to the doctor's office. Now, I'm against it, obviously, but only once in my life as a mental patient did I feel the stain and the shame of the stigma, and that was when the color drained out of my doctor's face at the prospect that I might go public. I remembered at that moment, oh yeah, I'm supposed to feel shame. When advocates for the mentally ill inveigh against this genuine injustice of this stigma, I've even received awards for battling it, my response is always the same. To borrow a phrase I've read from neuroscience, a cascade of negative associations flows unbidden from my unconscious mind. Some potent words have the power to unleash a flood of fear, of dark associations and stereotypes. And so, it seems to me, a campaign against stigma might well have the counterintuitive and counterproductive effect of strengthening the very associations and stereotypes that we're trying to eliminate. So I say let's talk about mental illness, and let's try to talk about it in a different way. Let's change the narrative. Cancer. There's a nasty word. My father could never bring himself to speak it. He'd say bad cells if he had to say anything. My mother was a cancer survivor, ovarian cancer, possibly uterine cancer, I don't know, because we never talked about it. Now, cancer is still a dreadful thing, but now we not only talk about it, we wear pink ribbons, we race for the cure. There is a new narrative, hope, not fear. Shrewd move. Let's do that. I had no hesitation in using the word stigma today because knowledge is the antidote to fear and the foundation of hope. And there is knowledge and hope in abundance in this room. So let's stop dwelling on stigma and start talking more about hope. I heard recently from her daughter that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis described herself as an idealist without illusions. I kind of think of myself as an optimist without illusions, which probably describes a lot of you. Yes, this is going to be a tough fight, but every time I come to the McGovern, I get a booster shot of optimism. And I'm wondering if maybe I could return the favor, because I think we're winning. I think we're winning the battle for public opinion, in part because people have a new vocabulary for this new narrative. Scholars talk about threshold moments when new ways of looking at the world are emerging, but the language of talking about them hasn't caught up. Here's a simple example. I overheard a conversation at my house. My girlfriend Judy had been working on a golf game with an instructor whose name was Lou. She was telling my husband about a drill, how Lou would say over and over, swing it to Lou, swing it to Lou. And I heard my husband Gary say, you were rewiring your brain. And Judy said, exactly. And I thought, exactly. Because the language of this new way of looking at the world is catching up. My parents never had that thought, that the brain would be wired. My children couldn't think of the brain in any other way. We have language now to think about the brain, even in its incomprehensible complexity, in terms we sort of understand. I talk about getting information or memory on my hard drive. Never mind that my memory has more in common with an Etch-a-Sketch. Never mind that I don't really have a clue what a hard drive is, or that I'm still pretty amazed at an Etch-a-Sketch. I cannot quite wrap my brain around this new idea of cloud computing, but I know it's not up in heaven. And I know that Apple's cloud people are not angels. They're geeks. God bless them. Metaphor is a simple bridge over complexity. And demystifying the brain is a step toward destigmatizing mental illness. Now, I'm not as high profile as Alan Alda, but I'm still recognized, especially now by people who have mental illness in their lives. Yes, they're burdened by worry, but not shame. We talk about it. And when I'm seen resuming a productive public life, I think that it's a booster shot of hope. And when I'm heard talking comfortably about mental illness, as comfortably as someone might talk about a triple bypass, I think I help to normalize mental illness. Normalizing, by the way, I think is a much better word than destigmatizing. Change the vocabulary, change the narrative, change minds, save lives. When I stood at that dark precipice of mental illness, I believe, perhaps because I was a journalist, perhaps because I didn't have experience with mental illness, but I believe I had already crossed over that threshold that I spoke about. And that night, my first night in a hospital, which was my hard landing, when I first really faced the reality of mental illness, I do remember thinking, I'm glad it's not cancer. I had hope. And to think that the medicine and the protocols that brought me back from the precipice were so 20th century. I'm an optimist without illusions. I know the fight will be hard and probably long, but the 21st century is so young. I'd like to close with a final thought. I'm told that people don't really have much control over what we remember or how we remember things, but I noticed that my memories that might have been filed away as the worst of times weren't. For example, when I was in the hospital, I had, I forgot the words, it's the Etch-a-Sketch thing, African violets. I had African violets in the window. And I have a watercolor painting that I made of them. It hangs in my home. And then one day, Gary and I had downsized, we'd moved. And one day I observed that, you know, the view from our new house is almost the same as the view from my hospital window. Isn't that interesting? And Gary said, well, you must have felt safe. I did. In fact, I do remember being a little afraid of going home. But I recovered. And not only did I have my family's blessing to talk about it, but Gary actually encouraged me to tell the story, how times have changed. We never talked about my mother's cancer, but while we don't dwell on my mental illness at home, it's not taboo, and my kids are free to joke about it. Crazy woman. If I hadn't felt safe at home, I wouldn't feel safe at this podium. People sometimes congratulate me for my courage, but the truth is I have never not felt safe talking about mental illness. People are at a threshold of a new way of looking at mental illness, and a lot of us have already crossed it. I have such a small role to play here at the McGovern Institute. But my personal goal is to see the conversation about mental illness destigmatized. Surely the better way to banish ugly, out-of-date attitudes is to replace them with new neural connections, positive associations. As they say, consciousness once raised cannot easily be lowered again. Demystifying mental illness is the best way to normalize mental illness, and nobody does that better than Alan Alda does. I'll end by saying thank you again, and thank you all for the work you do, and if you're donors, thank you for the work you support.